Strong tasks begin with a focus cluster of standards. As you recall, a focus cluster is the trio of Kentucky academic standards that will inform the primary focus of your task and instruction. In ELA, using the Kentucky academic standards for reading and writing, your focus cluster of standards should include 2 reading standards and 1 composition standard. Each standard in the focus cluster should leverage the other standards in the cluster to create opportunities for rigorous thinking work in your task. The first reading standard in the focus cluster, the what, addresses the disciplinary content your students should be thinking about during the task. The second reading standard in a focus cluster, the how, addresses how students are thinking about that content. The third standard in the cluster, the composition standard, articulates how students will communicate their thinking. Choosing the right focus cluster raises the rigor of your task, but how do you choose which standard should go in your focus cluster? Let's begin by thinking about how each of the Kentucky academic standards for reading and writing are multidimensional. Within each individual standard, there are 3 dimensions: content, analysis, and comprehension. These dimensions are hardwired into each standard and highlight not only the work each standard is doing, but how and why you should use that standard. Reviewing how multidimensionality works in a standard can aid you in choosing your focus cluster. Each Kentucky academic standard for reading and writing has content, analysis, and comprehension dimensions built into it. The content of a standard refers to the tools of an author and the objects of literacy woven into the skills students must access and apply when developing comprehension and performing analysis. Think of this as the what of each standard. What disciplinary content are students going to learn by working with this standard? In ELA, important disciplinary content could be the ability to recognize theme, language, structure, or character development. Each of these are content dimensions within the standards. The content dimension should guide you when thinking about that first reading standard in your focus cluster, the what. What content do you want your students grappling with during this task? Let's look at example RL.7.2. Determine themes of a text and analyze their development through citing textual evidence, paraphrasing, or summarizing. The content in this standard is themes. Being able to determine the theme of a text is a key process in ELA. Hence, when thinking about that first reading standard, what content you want students to be able to grapple with, determining the theme is an excellent choice. Once you have identified your first reading standard using the content dimension, you can start to think about your second reading standard. Remember that the second reading standard supports the first reading standard by identifying how your students should be thinking about that content. Let's return to our example, RL.7.2. We know we want students to be able to determine the theme in a text, but how should they do that? We can use the analysis dimension to answer this question. Analysis is the abstract dimension of each standard that requires more than an objective understanding of main ideas and key details. It's how your students will grapple with the context of the standard. In RL.7.2, the analysis dimension is determining and analyzing their development. So now we have our first reading standard, RL.7.2, and we know students need to be able to determine themes and analyze how those themes are developed. But students will still need support with that analysis dimension. What kind of development should they focus on? This is where that second reading standard in our focus cluster becomes important. It helps guide students with that analysis dimension. For example, we could pair RL.7.2 with RL.7.3, how elements of a story or drama influence each other. Or we could use RL.7.6, using the different perspectives or characters or narrators. Depending on the text chosen, one or both of these standards might work, so choosing one as your second reading standard guides students in the analysis portion of that first reading standard. If we choose RL.7.6 as our second reading standard, analyze how an author develops and contrasts the perspective of different characters or narrators in a text, then we will know that in order to determine the theme and analyze its development, As stated in RL.7.2, our first reading standard, students will need to use character or narrator point of view to trace that development. Finally, let's think about that third dimension in our reading standard, comprehension. Comprehension is the concrete dimension that requires an objective understanding of text, topic, or convention of language. It's how your students will communicate their content and analysis understanding from the standard. Let's return to RL.7.2, our first reading standard. Students will communicate the development of the theme they analyze by citing textual evidence, paraphrasing, or summarizing. As you can see, the comprehension dimension is directly related to the composition standard, which is our third standard in the focus cluster. If RL.7.2 is chosen as the first reading standard, we know that as part of the composing process, students will need to cite evidence effectively. For example, will they write an argument, C.7.1, or an informational or explanatory text, C.7.2? The evidence they choose and how they frame that evidence would be different depending on the composition standard chosen. Once you choose your first reading standard based on the content you want your students to grapple with, you can use the dimensions in that standard to find the second reading and composition standard pairs that will leverage those dimensions. In doing so, you will have selected your focus standards cluster that will guide the writing of your prompt, making it more rigorous than if it was based on one standard alone. Let's see how this works in a prompt. A prompt based solely on RL.7.2 could read, determine the theme in blank and analyze its development through citing textual evidence. While this prompt captures the essence of RL.7.2, it remains vague in how students should determine the theme, conduct their analysis, and share their findings. On the other hand, if we use the standards focus cluster we developed by looking at the multidimensionality of RL.7.2, we can develop the following prompt. After reading The Blind Man and the Elephant by John Godfrey Sachs, write a literary analysis in which you explain how the author develops a theme through the use of contrasting points of view. Support your discussion with evidence from the text. When we code the task for evidence of the focus cluster, we can see that each standard is represented and is working together to raise the rigor of the task. First, we see evidence of the first reading standard, RL.7.2, when the prompt calls on students to explain how the author develops a theme. We see evidence of the second reading standard, RL.7.6, when the prompt has students explain how the author develops a theme through the use of contrasting points of view. Finally, we see evidence of the composition standard, C.7.2, when the prompt calls on students to write a literary analysis in which they explain and use evidence from the text to support that explanation. When we place the prompts side by side, we can see that by using multidimensionality to build out a focus standard cluster, we end up giving the students a lot more information about how they should approach the text that they are reading. It also gives us insight into what the focus should be in this assignment. Let's look at one more example. We will start with the first reading standard, the content we want our students grappling with. If we choose RI.9-10.3, analyze how the author unfolds an analysis or series of ideas or events over the course of a text, including the order in which the points are made, how they are introduced and developed, and the connections that are drawn between them, it means we are interested in our students' ability to recognize development over the course of a text. We know this because the content dimension for this standard highlights an analysis or series of ideas or events. This standard without a focus cluster may leave students struggling with a task. A prompt based on this standard could be, how does Krakauer unfold McCandless's eventual demise in Into the Wild? Write an essay of at least 5 paragraphs. On the one hand, being able to determine how an author develops a series of ideas over the course of a text is a critical ELA skill. On the other hand, this prompt as written doesn't embed the level of rigor that we want from students. Students responding to this prompt may simply retell the story from start to finish, feeling that they met the demands of the standard driving this prompt. Such a response, however, would only be focusing on the content dimension of the standard. We can use the other dimensions then to select accompanying focus standards to create a focus cluster and raise the rigor of the task. To help us pick a second reading standard, we can look to the analysis dimension of this standard for guidance, shown here in purple. The analysis dimension shows us that we need to think about how an author showcases development, how he or she makes it happen in the text. We will need a second reading standard that can leverage that work. An author can do this in a number of ways: language, R4, structure, R5, or even point of view, R6. For this task, we will choose RI.9-10.5, analyze in detail how an author's ideas or claims are developed and refined by particular sentences, paragraphs, or larger portions of a text. Choosing this standard means that students will be thinking about an analysis or a series of ideas or events of a text through the lens of the text structure, with a focus on particular elements in that structure. In this case, by looking at particular sentences, paragraphs, or larger portions of a text. We now have our two reading standards. We just need a composition standard to round out our focus cluster. Let's return to our first reading standard and look at the comprehension dimension. Analyze how the author unfolds an analysis or series of ideas or events over the course of a text, including the order in which points are made, how they are introduced and developed, and the connections that are drawn between them. Students can demonstrate this comprehension in a written product using a composition standard. For this task, we will want them to write an informative or explanatory text, so we will choose C.9-10.2. Compose informative and/or explanatory text to examine and convey complex ideas, concepts, and information clearly and accurately through the effective selection, organization, and analysis of content. Using this focus cluster, we can write the following task. After reading Into the Wild and McCandless's journal excerpts, write a literary analysis in which you analyze how Krakauer unfolds the events of McCandless's journey by using pieces of McCandless's own writing at various intervals. Support your discussion with evidence from the text. Include a specific examination of one section of the novel that includes several pieces of McCandless's writing from the text in your response. When we code the task for evidence of the focus cluster, we can see that each standard is represented and is working together to raise the rigor of the task. Once again, when we place the prompts side by side, we can see that by using multidimensionality to build out a focus standard cluster, both teachers and students have more direction about how a text should be approached and interrogated. Let's take some time now to practice using multidimensionality in the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing to build out a focus cluster of standards. Before continuing, use your module guide to engage in some short activities that will support you in designing strong tasks using the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing. Task predicts performance, right? So how do we make sure every task is strong? While a focus cluster of standards is a good start, it isn't the only component of a strong task. In order to improve assignments to meet the rigor and demands of the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing, we should pay attention to three key elements in addition to the focus cluster. The three key elements are the right cognitive demand, an authentic disciplinary product, and the right complex text or text set for students to read and respond to. Let's start with choosing the right cognitive demand. Every assignment you give is an opportunity for students to practice a cognitive demand. That is, the primary type of thinking your students will engage in during the assignment. Depending on your grade level, discipline, and assignment type, the cognitive demand will change. That's why it's important to write your prompt cognizant of the kind of thinking work you want your students to do. For example, are you asking your students to define, describe, explain, analyze, compare, look at causation, critique, hypothesize, evaluate, problem solve? Let's return to our example to see how integrating a cognitive demand changes a task. As you may recall, the original task looked like this. Here, the only real demand is to write at least 5 paragraphs, but students aren't given any clue about how they should be thinking about doing that writing. Now, let's look at the standards-driven version. After reading Into the Wild and McCandless's journal excerpts, write a literary analysis in which you analyze how Krakauer unfolds the events of McCandless's journey by using pieces of McCandless's own writing at various intervals. In this version, students are asked to write a literary analysis in which they analyze. The word analyze is the cognitive demand. Students now know that when they begin reading and thinking about the text, they aren't being asked to compare or evaluate. Rather, they are going to need to analyze. This changes the kinds of questions they ask of the text, the notes they take in response to the text, and, of course, the writing they do to answer the prompt. Just as with adding a focus cluster, adding the cognitive demand tells you and your students exactly what the expectations will be. Now let's move on to that second element, an authentic disciplinary product. In school, students get really used to writing essays. Essays in English class, essays in science, essays in social studies. But when is the last time you wrote an essay in your professional life? What about when you were in college? Were you writing essays or were you writing lab and research reports, literary analyses, and impact statements? The truth is that while essays provide a nice umbrella term for most of the writing students do during their educational careers, the term essay does little to help students learn the demands of different kinds of writing products or the audiences for whom those products are written. Luckily, there's an easy fix. Instead of inviting students to write generic essays all the time, we can invite them to write authentic products in the discipline. So let's return to our example to see how this works. In the original prompt, students are told to write an essay of at least 5 paragraphs. This feels very much like an assignment in which the student has to write to prove to the teacher that he or she can retell the story in a text. There's nothing authentic about that because in real life, be it college or career, students rarely write to prove they know something. Rather, they write to communicate what they know to someone who doesn't know so that someone can then become knowledgeable, like them. So let's see how we can create those conditions in a school assignment. In this prompt, students are asked to write a literary analysis. This is an authentic product in ELA, and it raises the rigor in the prompt because it gives students an authentic audience with authentic needs that they must respond to in their writing. It forces them to think about choices in format, organization, and tone. They aren't writing to prove that they can retell a story, they're writing to explain to someone that their analysis of how Krakauer unfolds events in relation to his use of McCandless's journals is relevant and interesting. Finally, let's look at that third element, the right complex text for students to read and respond to. By looking at our focus cluster, we know that we need to choose a text that allows students to think about development through the lens of structure. This means that we need to choose a text that allows students to do that kind of analysis. If a text didn't include interesting choices about structure, or if there wasn't a clear connection between a text structure and the text development, it wouldn't be the right choice for this task. In this case, the task uses Into the Wild and McCandless's journals to allow students to do the kind of thinking and writing demanded by the standards in the focus cluster. The thought process that goes into writing in response to this task is more complex and therefore more rigorous than the thought process that goes into writing 5 paragraphs on how a story unfolds. Pairing a strong focus cluster with the right cognitive demand, disciplinary product, and complex text is key to improving a task. Return now to your module guide for resources on how to identify cognitive demands, disciplinary products, and complex texts that are authentic and appropriate for ELA tasks at each grade band.